Hi Year 4, I'm going to do your reading lesson with you today, and then we're going to read our next chapter of The Boy at the Back of the Class.
So our Viper skill today is retrieve and thinking about a non-fiction text, and we're going to focus today on some local geography. So here's the think question from Mrs. Price's lesson. Would you like to live near a river? Why or why not? Well, I wouldn't want to live near a river because I'd be worried that my house might flood, and flooding is the focus of our lesson today. Let's have a look at some of our tricky words today, shall we? Okay, so we've got the word occurred, frequent, relieved. See if you can say those with me. Occurred, frequent, relieved. So occurred means if something has happened or taken place. Frequent means it happens often, it happens a lot. And relieved means that you're no longer worried about something, you're glad about something. Can you work out the root word in this word? Have a look at it. Severely. Yes, well done. The root word is severe. Severe means that it's very serious, it's bad or it's harmful. We've got the ly suffix there. And here's a word from our Year 3-4 word list, our spelling list, extreme. And this is another word that you'll find in today's text, extreme. I wonder if you can think about a way of spelling this word. Extreme, it means a large amount of something. Pause the video and have a go at practicing it. Right, we're going to have a look at some of the vocabulary that we're going to find in today's text. So we've got the word flood. So a flood means if somewhere is flooded, it's covered in water, and that's particularly in this picture here where we can see that the road is flooded. We wouldn't normally have water on a road, so a flood means that it's covered in water. Launched, that means to start something. The rocket is launching here, so something is starting. A barrier is something such as a fence that stops something else moving past it. Residents. Residents are people who live somewhere. And prevented. Prevented means to stop something happening. See if you can choose 2 words from this vocabulary list and see if you can think of some actions to help you to remember them. So pause the video for a moment, see if you can practice some actions. How creative can you be? So our text today is a non-fiction text based on flooding. So I'm going to read the text and I'd like you to follow the text and join in with me if you can. Flooding in Britain. The first settlements were usually built away from marshy areas or places that might flood. Today, there are so many people living in Britain that more and more homes have to be built in areas at risk from flooding. People also like to build their homes on the flatland near rivers with a pleasant view. Now we're going to think about flooding in our local area, and we're going to focus our text now on Bewdley and the River Severn. So here we can see some of the words from earlier in the lesson. So we've got the word flood, remember that means covered in water, and the word occurred, that means it's something has happened, and then the word severely, there we go, that means badly, so it's been badly hit. Let's read it together and join in with me. Flooding in our local area. The largest flood in Bewdley occurred in 1947. The areas of Bewdley most severely hit by flooding are Sevenside North and Sevenside South. And here we can see that this is a photograph of Sevenside South in 1947. And you can see it's been very badly flooded, severely flooded. Over the years, flooding in Bewdley became more frequent, and in November 2000, another severe flood took place. And here we can see that Sevenside South in November 2000. Again, It was a really severe flood. We've got that word severe there, meaning bad or harmful. And then we've got that word frequent, meaning it happens a lot. So the flooding was now happening a lot in Bewdley. This photo shows Sevenside North in November 2000 with that severe flood. And the photo tells us just how bad the floods were. Do you recognise this part of Bewdley? We can walk down here normally, but you can see here it is severely flooded. As a result of these floods, the Bewdley Flood Defence Scheme was launched. Remember, launched means started. Flood barriers were erected in areas of Bewdley which were most likely to flood. And here we can see a photograph of Sevenside North in February 2020. Here we can see the barriers. Remember that word, barriers? And we have now, when the river's high, a huge metal fence which stops the river flooding people's homes. Do you remember this word from earlier in reading this week? Erected. Can you think of another word that means the same as erected? Yes, well done. Built. That's right. Flood barriers were built in areas of Bewdley which were most likely to flood. The residents living alongside the river were extremely relieved because the barriers prevented their homes from being flooded. And here we have a photograph of Sevenside South in February 2020. And again, we had some very bad floods, severe floods in 2020, and the flood barriers were put up to stop people's homes from being flooded. Can you see some of the words that we looked at earlier in the lesson? Have a little look at some of the vocabulary or tricky words. Can you spot them? Yes, so we've got the words residents. Remember, those are people that live somewhere. And extremely, so they were very relieved. They were no longer worried because the barriers prevented their homes from being flooded. So the barriers stopped their homes from being flooded. So we're going to finish today's lesson with a your turn, and you're going to use your retrieval skills to answer some true or false statements. Okay, let's have a look at them together. So the first statement is the first settlements were usually built on floodplains. Second one, is this true or false? The largest flood in Bewdley happened in 1947. Is that true or false? Flood barriers were built in all areas of Bewdley. Is that true or false? And the residents living near the river in Bewdley were glad when the flood barriers were built. Okay, so Chilly Ones, with some support, I'd like you to look back at the text and can you say whether each statement is true or false? Chilly 2, you're going to independently reread the text now to work out if each statement is true or false by looking for evidence in the text. And Chilly 3, justify your answer by backing it up with evidence from the text. And you can use these sentence starters here to justify your answer. So I'd like you to pause the video now and write these statements in your book or on paper. And then when you've written them down, go back to reread the text to find the answers. Remember, you're thinking about your scanning skills that you've been developing recently. So you're going to look at each statement, look for the key words, and then you're going to go back into the text to scan for those key words. So pause the video, write your statements, and then I'll join you in a moment for the answers. Okay, how did you get on with those statements? Let's have a look at the check part of the lesson now. So the first statement was the first settlements were usually built on floodplains. Well, the text actually states that the first settlements were usually built away from marshy areas or places that might flood. So that word away is our key word there that tells us that this statement is false. Let's have a look at the next one. the largest flood in Bewdley happened in 1947. Well, that's true, because in the text it states the largest flood in Bewdley occurred in 1947. If you remember right at the start of the lesson, we looked at that word occurred, because occurred is another word for happened. Flood barriers were built in all areas of Bewdley. Well, that's false, because flood barriers were erected, remember erected is another word for built, in areas of Bewdley which were most likely to flood. So they only put the barriers up in the areas where flooding was most likely. And then the final statement, the residents living near the river in Bewdley were glad when the flood barriers were built. Well, that's true, because the text states the residents living alongside the river were extremely relieved because the barriers prevented their homes from being flooded. And we know that relieved meant glad. Glad is another word for relieved, or they are no longer worried. Okay, well done with that. Okay, so just to finish off then, we're going to have a little look at this photograph. Here is an aerial photograph. Remember, that's taken from the air, the sky. Here is an aerial photograph of the River Stour next to Puxton Marsh, and it has flooded onto the floodplain. Now, if you look here, this is actually where we filmed the Igniter video, and you can see that this photograph looks very different to the video where myself and Miss Bridgewater and Mrs. Price and Miss Murphy stood and talked to you. Would you like to live there? So have a think. This is the floodplain along the side of the River Stour that we talked about. Would you want to live here? Talk to your grown-up and tell them why or why not. And in a moment, we'll think about our next chapter of our class text.
And now we're going to read the next chapter of our class text, chapter 11, The Game of Scrabble. After hearing Ahmet's story and seeing his pictures, I was bursting with lots of new questions. So were Tom and Josie and Michael, but we knew we couldn't ask Ahmet anything. We should write them down, suggested Josie, then maybe after the holidays Ahmet will have put some more pieces back together. And Mrs. Khan will think it's okay for us to ask him. We all agreed, so when I got home that night I took out my old list of questions and, after crossing out the ones that I had the answers to, I wrote the new questions out in my very best handwriting, just to make sure we wouldn't forget any of them. And this is what the list looked like. So those are the questions that answers have been found, and then we have some more questions at the bottom. Our 5 new questions. What is your sister's name and where is she now? Why wasn't your mum in the last picture? What happened to the cat? How long did it take you to walk to France? And finally, who are the bullies who dropped bombs on your house? After I had finished writing them out, I put the list in the front pocket of my rucksack. I would have to wait until the holiday was over to find out if Ahmet was ready to answer any of them. I know everyone in school likes the holidays, but I don't. Not really. Mum still has to work, and she can't afford to send me to holiday camp or for extra activities, so I have to spend most of my time with Mrs. Abbey. Usually Michael and Josie's parents come and take me to their house for a day, but Michael's parents were taking him on holiday to France, and Josie was going camping. And Tom and his brothers were visiting family near the seaside, so there was no one to play with this holiday. The week felt extra long and extra boring because London had what Mum calls a grey day week. That's when all the days are so cold and grey and wet and blustery that you don't want to get out of your pyjamas or your bed, and the whole week feels like one long grey day that you can't wait to be over. But on the Sunday morning before school opened again, just as Mum was reading her newspapers and I was trying to decide what we should do for our Sunday adventure, the phone rang. Mum picked it up, and when she put it back down again she was biting her lip and frowning. That meant she had forgotten something important and was feeling angry at herself. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot. But that was your Uncle Lenny on the phone reminding me that he's coming to lunch today." I jumped up in excitement. "With your Aunt Christina and baby Jacob," she added. I sat back down and made a face. "Oh, can't Uncle Lenny just come on his own?" I asked. Mum shook her head. "No, he can't. Your aunt and Jacob haven't been here in a while, so it's nice they want to come." And then, noticing that I was still making a face, she added, "And guess what? Your Uncle Lenny is bringing lunch, a roast chicken, your favourite, and he wants to play a Scrabble match, so you're to set the board up immediately." I jumped up and ran to my bedroom to get the Scrabble board from underneath my bed. I love Scrabble more than all the other board games because it's the only game that I don't ever get bored playing. Dad always used to let me win by placing his letters in silly places so that he would get the lowest points. But Mum and Uncle Lenny never play low-scoring words on purpose because Mum says that helping me to win is cheating. She does let me use the dictionary though, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair. After all, she and Uncle Lenny are older and cleverer and know lots more words than a 9 3/4-year-old could ever know. And just like that, I didn't mind Aunt Christina and Jacob coming at all, because there was nothing I loved better than eating my Uncle Lenny's roast chicken, except playing Scrabble with him. Just like Josie, Uncle Lenny is in all my best memories too. When Dad died, I remembered him being at the hospital with us and hugging Mum and me a lot. That was when he started calling me his brave little tiger. I don't know why, because I didn't feel even the tiniest bit brave. But I didn't mind, because after the funeral he was the only person who stayed behind and helped Mum sort everything out. None of my other uncles and aunts who visited us that day ever came back to see Mum and me again. Mum's friends try and visit when they can, and Josie's mum is always asking us if we need any help, but they're busy with work just like Mum is. Sometimes I think most of the people who came to the funeral were all really witches and wizards who had appeared out of thin air just so that they could eat a buffet and shake their heads a lot before disappearing again. It was good they disappeared because most of them smelled like old mothballs and tried to pinch my cheeks until they hurt. That's another reason I love Uncle Lenny. He's never ever pinched my cheeks or smelled like mothballs. He smells like warm bread most of the time and freshly baked cookies some of the time. He's a taxi driver and only works at night. He loves his job and tells us the funniest stories about all the different kinds of people who have jumped into the back of his car. Like the time a famous actress got in and ordered him to drive around for a whole hour just so she could get some sleep. Or the time a large Italian family spent the whole ride silently fighting over a single portion of fish and chips. Whenever my Uncle Lenny visits us, he always brings a large bag of food shopping and a chocolate bar just for me. He doesn't usually come with my Aunt Christina because she doesn't like us. I don't know why, but it's okay because I don't like her either. She's very beautiful and is always perfectly dressed with perfect hair and with perfect makeup on her face, but she wrinkles up her nose whenever she sees something she doesn't like, which is nearly all the time. So she always looks as if she smelled a bag of bad eggs. She has a fake smile too. It's one of those smiles that shows lots of teeth, but which never travels to any other part of her face. I don't trust people who can't smile with their whole face. It means they're trying to hide something from you. Fake smiles always make me want to get as far away from the fake smiler as possible. Their son Jacob is okay, but he's only 2 and likes to break things, so I try to hide all of my best toys from him when he comes over. After I finished setting up the Scrabble board, I helped Mum tidy up the house and was making my bed sheets extra straight when the doorbell rang. All right, all right, all right, how's my favourite nearly 10-year-old doing? Shouted Uncle Lenny when I opened the door. He always says that, even though I know I'm the only nearly 10-year-old he knows, which means he can't have any other favourites. OK, I shrugged. Only OK? He asked, bending down and looking at me in the eyes. Might need to send you to the smile doctor. I smiled wider. That's better. He ruffled my hair and gave me a kiss on the cheek, and then heaved 2 large grocery bags into the kitchen. Afternoon, said my Aunt Christina. Her lips were pinched together and she was wearing so much perfume that it made my nose tickle. Jacob's asleep, so you'll have to play with him later, she said matter-of-factly, as she carried Jacob in through the door and stuck out her pointy face at me. I stood on my tiptoes and gave her a kiss. She pulled away quickly. Right, what have you been up to then? Asked Uncle Lenny as he came and steered me to the kitchen table. I think he must be so used to driving his taxi that he liked to drive people around too. Nothing, I shrugged. Do you want to play Scrabble with me now, Uncle Lenny? We'll have a game after lunch, my little tiger, he smiled. I'm not on till 5 today. Darling, why don't you tell Uncle Lenny all about your new friend? Asked Mum as she set the table. Oh yeah, the pomegranate boy, said Uncle Lenny. Your mum told me. What's happening there then? Oh, lots, I said. I began to tell him all about the big fight and the mysterious plant pot murder and the great baked beans bag trap and Ahmet's story. And as we ate our lunch, I told them all about the bombs and the fires and the orange boat and the tents and Ahmet's cat and the railway track and the wall with the barbed wire on it. Uncle Lenny shook his head and muttered, "Poor Tyke," every few minutes, and Mum nodded along, looking sad sometimes, but Aunt Christina just looked bored. Then, just as I was about to tell them about my new list of questions, Aunt Christina said, "It doesn't surprise me you would want to be friends with a refugee kid at all. You have lots of things in common with him, what with your gran having been a refugee too." Uncle Lenny and Mum looked up sharply. I can't even begin to think about it. Imagine being a war refugee back in the day, before they all got loads of benefits and houses nicer than our ones. Uncle Lenny looked up angrily and was about to say something when, just then, Jacob began to cry. Aunt Christina jumped up and with a sniff said, "Oh dear, seems he's christened the nappy again," before rushing out of the room. "Mum, is that true?" I asked, looking at Mum so hard that it felt like my eyes were about to pop out of my head. "Was Gran a refugee too?" "All yours," muttered Uncle Lenny as he got up and walked over to one of the shopping bags. "I'll get dessert, shall I?" Mum looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Yes, sweetheart, it is. Your Grandma Jo. We went to see her with Daddy when you were little. Do you remember her?" I nodded, not because I really remembered anything, but because I had looked at all the photographs hundreds of times. I was 5, and it was the last time my mum and dad and me went on holiday in a real-life plane. We went to a town called Salzburg, which is in a country called Austria, because that's where Dad lived before he moved to England. He used to talk about the mountains and the rivers and the way that the birds always seemed to follow him around. He looked so happy in all the photographs. So did Mum. I seemed to be crying in most of my photos, so I'm not sure if I was happy or not. I don't really remember anything about the trip except for the large green wooden caravan my Grandma Jo had in her back garden. Dad used to sleep in it in the summer holidays when he was a boy. My granddad had built it before he died, which is why Dad wanted to become a carpenter. There's a photo of me and Dad sitting on its steps, and it's the only photo of me where I'm not crying. Even then I must have liked the idea of sleeping in a bright green caravan. I couldn't really remember anything about my Grandma Jo, but We had lots and lots of photos of her and Dad, and I always looked at them when I missed Dad too much. She had short grey hair and wore glasses that were tied to a long golden chain, and she always wore flowery tops and white trousers. I wished I could have remembered her more, but sometimes, no matter how hard you try, or how badly you might want to, your brain can't reach that far back. Why was she a refugee? I asked. Did she run away from bombs like Armit? Mum stayed quiet as Uncle Lenny placed 4 large chocolate eclairs on the table in front of us. I love chocolate eclairs because it's like having 3 desserts in one. But as much as I wanted to eat my eclair, I wanted to hear the answers to my questions more. Uncle Lenny sat back down and cleared his throat. I don't think they've done World War II in school yet, have they? He asked my mum quietly. Mum shook her head. World War II? I asked. You mean there was another one? Uncle Lenny nodded. Yup, just like the one you learnt about last year, but twice as bad, he whispered, as though it was a secret. Mum put my eclair on a plate and pushed it towards me. All you need to know, darling, is that Grandma Jo was a wonderful person and that she helped lots of refugees just like your friend Armit run away from a war too, she said. Were they running away from Syria as well? I asked, wondering just how long a war lasted. No, darling, said Mum, putting her own eclair on a plate. They ran away from a different war, one that was started in Germany, and they were running away from people who called themselves Nazis. Oh, I said, wondering just how many wars I needed to learn about. Anyway, the important thing is she survived, and she got to see you, exclaimed Uncle Lenny as he gave my hair a stroke. Exactly, said Mum, tapping my hand. Now eat up and let's get a game of Scrabble going before Uncle Lenny has to leave. I nodded, and knowing that my mum didn't want me to ask any more questions, I broke open my eclair. That afternoon Uncle Lenny stayed and played 2 whole games of Scrabble with us, and Aunt Christina watched Jacob break one of Mum's vases, rip a book and throw my Lego bricks across the room. Mum won the first game and Uncle Lenny won the second one, and I got the lowest points I had ever gotten in history. But I didn't mind. I don't think you can really focus on playing a game when you've just found out that your grandma was a refugee who had helped lots of other refugees run away from a war too, even if you're playing a game that's as fun as Scrabble.